Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Sakamoto, artist, scholar, and director of the Asian and Asian American Arts and Culture program, and also the performing arts curator at the UMass Fine Arts Center. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second installment of Codemakers, our artist activist conversation series. This evening with Phil Tian and Georgina Pazcoguin of Final Bow for Yellowface, and also Cerise Jacobs and Tian of Whitesnake Projects. We begin by stating that the University of Massachusetts Amherst acknowledges that it was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pocumtuck Nation on the land of the Norwottuck community. We begin with gratitude for nearby waters and lands. We recognize these lands and waters as important relations with which we are all interconnected and depend on to sustain life and well-being. The Pocumtuck had connections with these lands for millennia. Over 400 years of colonization. When Pocumtuck peoples were displaced, many joined their Algonquian relatives to the east, south, west, and north. That includes Mashpee and Aquinnah-Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, Mohegan, Pequot, and Mohican communities, and Abenaki and other nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy. These native peoples still maintain connections and relationships of care for these lands today. We also acknowledge that the University of Massachusetts Amherst is a land-grant university. As part of the Morrill Land Grant Act, portions of land from 84 Native nations west of the Mississippi were sold to provide the resources to found and build this university. As an active first step towards decolonization, we encourage you to learn more about the Native nations whose homelands UMass Amherst now resides on and the indigenous homelands on which you live and work. We also invite you to deepen your relationship to these living lands and waters. We further acknowledge through language courtesy of Groundwater Arts that this event's virtual platform, YouTube, is headquartered in what is commonly known as San Bruno, California, on the traditional lands of the Ohlone, Ramaytush, and Muwekma peoples, because the digital platform is made possible by physical land and the indigenous people who steward it. This event is sponsored by the Massachusetts Cultural Council, Daily Hampshire Gazette, New England Public Media, the UMass Auxiliary Services, and Hotel UMass. And now to introduce our guests. Whitesnake Projects is an activist opera company making mission-driven work that unites art making with civic practice and operates also at the forefront of technology in multiple fields. Final Bow for Yellowface is the campaign to end negative depictions of Asians in the dance world and lift up Asian American choreographers and dancers as well. Cerise Jacobs is founder and creator of Whitesnake Projects and forges new American opera from her past in multicultural Singapore, her world travels, and the social issues of our time, creating original libretti that range from the mythological to the topical. Jacobs grew up absorbing Chinese, Malay, Indian, and Western cultures. After studies at the University of Pittsburgh and Harvard Law School, her two-decade law career included serving as a trial partner at one of the largest law firms in New England, and also 5 years as a prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. After retiring from the law, Jacobs returned to her creative voice in opera, music, art, and food. Jacobs is the president of the Charles and Cerise Jacobs Charitable Foundation and has endowed the Charles M. Jacob Fund for Equal Rights and Social Engagement at the University of Chicago Law School and College. Jacobs was named a 2017 Mover and Shaper by Musical America and one of Boston's 100 most influential people of color by the Boston Globe. Tian is music director of the Pioneer Valley Symphony, Boston Opera Collaborative, and the Victory Players. He has assisted in and premiered new works by internationally lauded composers Chaya Cherwanin, Kurt Cacioppo, Aaron J. Kernis, David Sanford, and Joan Tower. At the age of 20, Eng conducted his first opera, Stravinsky's The Rake's Progress. He has conducted many new works, including the first opera in Yoruba, Nigeria, Irin Ajo by Olabode Omojola, works for orchestra and interactive electronics like Gray Noise Litanies by Gregory W. Brown, and Dark River, an opera about civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer that fuses Motown and Verdi. Phil Tian is co-founder of Final Bow for Yellowface and author of the book Final Bow for Yellowface, Dancing Between Intention and Impact. He is currently a 2021-22 visiting scholar at the APA Institute at New York University and the Manhattan School of Music's 21-22 Citizen Artist. Chen is a graduate of Carleton College and an alumnus of the Ailey School. As a writer, Chan served as the executive director for Flat magazine and contributed to Dance Europe magazine, Dance Business Weekly, and the Huffington Post. His next project, the Ballet des Porcelains, will premiere at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in December 2021. Georgina Pazcoguin, otherwise known as the Rogue Ballerina, is co-founder of Final Bow for Yellowface as well, and soloist with the New York City Ballet. She was featured on the hit TV show Fosse Verdon and was featured in the film New York Export Opus Jazz, which won the Audience Award at the 2010 South by Southwest Film Festival. Pazcoguin's New York City Ballet credits include the role of Anita in West Side Story. Her extensive repertory of George Balanchine works include lead roles in A Midsummer Night's Dream and Tchaikovsky's Suite No. 3. Pazcoguin was a recipient of the May L. Wien Award for Outstanding Promise. She's a two-time Chita Rivera Award nominee for Outstanding Dancer and also the recipient of the 2019 Outstanding Filipinos in America Courage of Conviction Award. And now, please welcome this evening's artists. Good evening, everyone. How is everyone?
Can't complain.
Now that I've handed Manicotti off, I'm well, because he is like so needy and agitated.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad to finally be here with you in this beautiful moment in this beautiful virtual space. This is a moment I've been really looking forward to for a long time. I've been admirers of all of your work, all of your efforts on stage, in the virtual screen, the virtual stage, and socially for many years now. And I can't wait to just have this have a beautiful conversation and just really kind of get into the meat of what it is that you do and why and everything. So for the audience, what we're going to do first is, in turn, we're going to kind of do a little backgrounder on each of the projects. First with Georgina and Phil from Final Bow for Yellowface, and then afterwards Cerise and Tian from Whitesnake. So Phil and Georgina, do you want to give us a little context or background on Final Bow for Yellowface and your efforts in the dance world?
Of course. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm really honored to be part of this conversation. The history of Final Bow for Yellowface. I mean, we are a toddler now. We're 5 years old. 5 years. And it started, this discussion, our initiative started when I was called in to be part of a group diversity discussion with New York City Ballet. And in that discussion, we were finally starting to make headway with then boss Peter Martins about what the experience was for dancers of color in this space, in this institution of New York City Ballet. And it's a safe space, so I can't jump into all of the details, but basically Nutcracker came out and he had asked a question about casting a dancer of color in one specific role. And I, in my infinite bluntness, was like, you can do whatever you'd like. Everyone at New York City Ballet is a wonderful dancer. You're going to have more problems with the Chinese divertissement. And that kind of spurred a reaction in him being like, you're right. Every year I get more and more letters of complaints about the offensiveness of this 30-second divertissement. And this spurred a discussion, and I brought up, well, I happen to know somebody who could give you wonderful insight. Thus, I brought Phil Chin into the discussion. I think the story goes, I left one of those 4-hour meetings, called him on the way to rehearsal and was like, Debbie Coolish, who's the secretary for Peter Martins, may or may not call you. I don't know. I got to run. Bye. And so she did, like an hour or two later, and a conversation was had with Peter and Phil, and they focused in on 3 points of the divertissement, which was the music, the choreography, the makeup, and the cost. Well, that's 4. Costuming. It was costuming, makeup, and choreography. And it was simple changes because on one hand, this is George Balanchine's work. There's a lot of tradition, and he is no longer with us. So how do you change an artist's work to be inclusive in this time? But on the other hand, these gestures were offending people. So the fingers were removed from the variation. And at one point in the finale, the whole stage was doing finger movements, which now is a beautiful port de bras, and it makes no difference to the audience. And it's just, it was amazing to hear how simple the changes were. Granted, Phil and I both think that you could layer in some more character into the divertissement now so that it could be more exciting. It is the land of sweets. It is a fantasy land. But yeah, then we started a website, put a pledge, and it's like, we can get New York City Ballet to change its Nutcracker. Why don't we aim for every major company? And in doing so, we will have a trickle down effect to every regional company. And sure enough, 5 years later, every single major company and many regional dance troops have signed the pledge and have started the discussion in changing and eliminating Yellowface on stage in ballets.
The Paris Opera just cited us as in their diversity report, and they cited us by name as a contributing factor to their decision to no longer do blackface or yellowface. So at this point, Gina's the ballerina and I'm the dance scholar. So a lot of my research that complements this conversation has been looking at Orientalist ballets from the 1700s to today. So looking at sort of Europe's portrayals of Asia, like when we set a story in this sort of fantasy exotic China or Japan or the Middle East, what are we actually doing? What are we actually saying? What can we only say when the story takes place in one of these exotic locations? So things like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? We don't do those things here in Europe, but like those people over there, probably do all sorts of crazy things. And one of the big takeaways from looking at all of these Orientalist portrayals was that I'm sort of realizing that Orientalism has really been the greatest driver of creativity and innovation in the Western performing arts. And I think that's because when you don't have all of the information, the gaps in between, you need to use your imagination to make up for what's there. So if we Europeans walk upright, maybe you Orientals walk sideways or, whatever. And it's in those spaces that suddenly you're seeing new ways of moving, new ways of new stories, new sort of boundaries of where the human psychology and the human experience are, because you're not constrained by reality. The problem is all of those fantasy depictions were okay when we were a homogenous, European, Eurocentric society where everyone in the room was European. It didn't matter. But now we have a multiracial society. We have people, our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues have all different ethnicities, come from all different cultures. Even just on this block alone, there's 20 different restaurants that all come from different parts of the world. So that's a very different climate than what opera was like in the 19th century or what ballet was like in the 19th century, where the czar or the king paid for it and it reflected his worldview. And now we're the ones in the audience. We're the donors. We're the ones dropping off our kids at the schools, and so a lot of this work that we see, the Turandos, the Madame Butterflies, the Le Corsairs, the Bugakus, all these sort of fantasy places, we can't just say to people of color, hey, come on in. We want you to be involved in this art form. But here's this offensive, chinky version of your culture or this fantasy of your culture that doesn't ring true or is sort of the ugliest version of your culture, but please donate your money and buy a ticket to next season. It doesn't work that way. So a lot of our work has been questioning sort of the heart of that. And you'll see from, Gina's own experience as a dancer of Asian descent in a primarily white space, what that conflict actually does and what that impact is on a performer.
Right. Just to give you a little context of who George Balanchine is, he co-founded New York City Ballet. New York City Ballet, I'm going to argue, is one of the best companies in the world.
Yet you've never had a Black or Asian principal ballerina in the company, so can't be that great, but go on.
All right. That is fact. And as I didn't embark upon this career path thinking that I would be a first. And sure enough, when I was promoted from corps de ballet to soloist in 2013, I became New York City Ballet's first Asian American woman in the 70. That's a 70-year history of the ballet company's existence. What does that mean? How does that experience influence and impact me as a dancer? Well, first and foremost, the nature of my job is that it starts very young. So I left home at the age of 16 and went and stayed in a dorm, and in the hallways of the School of American Ballet are fun pictures of dancers, none of whom remotely resembled me. I think the only woman of color who I saw occasionally up on the wall was Maria Tallchief. And so like I found myself looking towards Maria Tallchief. I did not know, unfortunately, because she wasn't in this single focus New York City Ballet lane, who even Sono Asante was. I do now. And my other influence was Alicia Alonso. And to be at the top of the school and then be selected by Pierre Martins to join the company, and then to all of a sudden be told to get a scholarship, to win the Wien Award, which is a really high value, like $10,000 award given for outstanding promise, and then to get reinserted down at the bottom totem pole, as everyone would do, like this is normal, and then to all of a sudden be told you don't fit in was a shock. And it took a lot of time as like a young person, as like 17, barely a young adult, to understand that what they were saying was they were asking me to assimilate into this white Eurocentric world. Please don't get tan. Please do your makeup a different way. So I have actually been asked to look less Oriental on stage. And that is a wild thing to experience, because I had to turn to my then boss and say, you do realize that I am of Asian descent. That is impossible for me to change. And it has influenced, I feel like it has been a barrier in a sense, that I have to constantly prove myself in trying to line up to this ideal of not only what a ballerina is, but what this ideal of a Balanchine ballerina is, which has predominantly been this, all-American looking ballerina. But the way I view my definition of all-American is us here, but it's different for the leaders of the New York City Ballet. And what's unfortunate is that's one sole person that decides each one of the 96 dancers' individual career paths. So that just kind of gives you a really short insight into what my experience as a multicultural woman in this white Eurocentric space has been.
So I think one of the big things too with Final Bow, this is our 5th year this year, and we're looking at the flip side of the coin, which is, so far the last 5 years have been focused on Asian representation, like physically, Yellowface, basically tearing down caricatures of Asian people. And now we're starting to look at the other side of the equation, which is, well, where are the Asian voices actually telling our own stories? And so we're sort of moving into the next phase of our organization. We're starting a foundation called the Gold Standard Arts Foundation. And it's really a service organization for Asian American creative professionals who want to work in dance. So not just for choreographers, but composers, lighting designers, set designers, fashion designers, directors, anybody who wants to collaborate with other Asian American artists, but specifically around making dances. So we're looking at building out a professional development series. We're starting quite an aggressive data collection process to actually track, okay, how many Asian choreographers have been commissioned by the top 25 ballet companies in the last 5 years. And then every year we're going to be tracking this data. So we're actually going to be able to say, okay, where's the field moving? What does equity really look like? We've all posted the black square for George Floyd last year. Where's the actual walking the walk? What does that actually look like? So it's data collection, it's professional development, it's commissioning new works by Asian Americans. Right now we've partnered with a lucky 8 American ballet companies to commission works by Asian choreographers. So far in our work, we've paired up 5 Asian choreographers. 4 of them are women. We also have a big gender gap in terms of men versus women who are allowed to make work.
Surprise.
So we're actively having a little intersectionality where we're not just advocating for Asians, but also women voices as well. And it's not just one single Asian artist who is getting all these commissions. Each of these 5 commissions are from a different artist. So there isn't that pressure to say like, oh, well, if I don't do a good job, no one's going to hire another Asian for another generation. So it's really all of us moving forward together as a group. And I think a large part of that happened after the shooting in Atlanta. And, the entire dance community came to look at Gina and I, and we were sort of surprised by that. We were processing our own fear and anger and frustration and hurt and confusion. And then to have to be sort of a shaman, a healer, a community organizer at the same time was really highlighted for us that there was just this need for our community. There needed to be this space. We needed to organize. We needed to talk to each other. We needed to share resources and network. So this sort of next phase of our work is really empowering Asian artists to tell their own stories, which is why I think we are so excited to be a part of this conversation with the Whitesnake projects, because that's really the sort of lived next step of what we're trying to do with Final Bow and with Gold Standard Arts Foundation. You guys are doing quite successfully in opera and actually empowering people who look like us to tell stories that reflect our experience and not apologizing for it. So really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgina and Phil. That's a perfect segue to introduce Cerise and Tian and their work. And I've been excited about Whitesnake's project for a long time for exactly, frankly, the reasons, more than anything that Phil just articulated. So Cerise and Tian, maybe you can give us a little background on your, the whole range of your efforts.
Yes, well, I will start off and then hand it off to Tian. But Whitesnake was really founded because I am an outsider in so many ways to the opera world, and I find it interesting that Michael put the world of ballet and the world of opera in the same forum, because of course these two art forms are the epitome of the so-called high art, white, Eurocentric, male dominated, sorry, men on this panel, kind of art form. And I found that and coupled with my background, because I'm ethnically Chinese, I'm an immigrant from Singapore, as is Tian, and we bonded over that and food and music and activism, and also the fact that I am outside. I was outside of the music or arts industry because I spent the first 20 some years of my career as a litigator, as a trial lawyer in a big Boston law firm, and then at the United States Attorney's Office. So who was this sort of upstart that can come into opera and say, you know what, I'm going to make new opera that is unique to my own culture, And I found that, of course, the doors were firmly closed to me. And I decided that if nobody from the sort of mainstream opera companies would invite me to their table, I would make my own table. And I would invite other people who are just like me to sit at the same table with me. Hence, Whitesnake Projects. Hence, our mission to create original work that speaks with a unique voice, that is mission driven, but yet with high artistic standards and incredible production values. And I also found that opera was a sort of old person sort of art form, mired in the 18th and 19th century. and that the audience was usually older and more affluent, and as I said, predominantly white, and that it became not a language. I mean, I love some of the old repertory, don't get me wrong, but the storytelling just absolutely slayed me, just slayed me. And also their attitudes of not keeping up with what the 21st century is. I mean, we have so much amazing technology. The young people live on their tablets, their phones, their computers, and what do? We do the same old, same old, same old. So it also is part of our mission to integrate that kind of technology into our storytelling, so that we combine the latest, the cutting edge 21st century technology with storytelling from a unique activist perspective, and sound and oral world that reflects different BIPOC composers. And then with that, the pandemic, of course, gave us an incredible opportunity to experiment with these three elements. And with that, I think, Tian, you want to start talking about the last 18 months of our lives in which we produced 3 cutting-edge world premiere operas on pandemic themes in under 1 year.
Yes, I'm definitely going to do that. I've also wanted to kind of just give people some context, because for my own work, because as a conductor, I joined Whitesnake Projects as a music director last year. So so I wasn't there at the very, very outset of the company. But what Cerise and I found was a great kind of synchrony of interest and activism. And for me, I'm also originally from Singapore, and I did my undergraduate training in the UK, and then I came to the States and I've stayed. And I was always very conscious of the otherness of this, because I came from a place where, in order to get the hold of a conducting textbook, I had to I'm admitting to a crime, I suppose. I photocopied the only copy in the National Library, because that was the only place I could get something, right? So the sense of it being something that was very precious, and actually also informs my approach, which is that I'm very aware of the fact that I didn't grow up living and breathing Puccini, for example. My mother did not run around singing Puccini as she cooked, right? So that on the other hand, I did have Chinese opera in the house, and I did have traditional Chinese music and gombang in the side. So and yet due to all kinds of things related to our kind of post-colonial reality there, we didn't kind of explore that academically, interestingly, until way after my own generation started kind of advocating for that. So I find myself arriving here in the US, and I asked the question of, having been working in Singapore, where I was working with dance and film and theater and doing all kinds of interdisciplinary stuff, always looking at the art of it, and then finding myself asking the question of, like, where is that performance practice class that I was wanting to take in African American music? Where is the thing in Native American music? And I would ask some of my professors, and the answer was blank. And I could see that this work was emerging, and I wasn't quite satisfied with a no answer as an answer. And so the only way you could solve this was by working on it. And so I started looking out and reaching out to artists and just talking to them. And then I still remember, conversations with, wonderful colleagues like Nkiro Okoye, and she says to me, Tian, if you want to do this, I want to make sure that you understand that this is Black music, right? And that, I'm happy to have that conversation about it, but let's be clear about that. And I want to make sure you're open to it. And I said, of course, that's the reason why I'm calling you up, and she was like, well, that's good, because some people don't want to hear from me. And, thus is this kind of conversation of kind of intercultural work, and indirectly and resulting in me kind of advocating for underrepresented composers for the past 10, 15 years of my professional work, which brings us to this fantastic collaboration and partnership with Cerise in Whitesnake Projects, which literally came about, as I said, in a theater in in Germany watching a dystopian 25th century opera based on Beethoven's Nine, and it was so bad that I Googled, so somebody must be doing cutting edge opera in America, like that maybe I might resonate with, and I just couldn't believe who I found. So this, kind of connects back with, the work that I'm supposed to talk about, which is this last 18 months of intense collaboration. And what we've done is to look at this pandemic moment. And one of the things that we've been talking about is the immediacy and the need for these stories to be told through music and through theater, and these incredibly long timelines that opera usually has, like 3 to 5 years to develop. And we developed, I think, Alice in the Pandemic in something like 3 months, and we started rehearsing.
Well, I think Jorge composed it in
a month.
3. He was a wild man, Jorge Sosa. But I think I decided. I called you and Jorge and Elena. So, we knew that it was either go dark or create something new, like immediately, right? And who should I call upon but my team from the 2019 show, which was a show about dreamers. I'm a dreamer who no longer dream, because that responded to Trump's revocation of DACA. And so I called up Tian, my music director, and said, Tian, do you think it's insane if we made a new work now about the pandemic? And I called Elena Arauz, who was my director in the prior show, and Jorge Sosa, who was the composer. And we all brainstormed Alice, and we produced it in the fall of 2020. Believe it or not, conceived, written, developed, composed, staged, produced, and presented. But Tian, you want to talk about some of the trials and tribulations?
That's what I mean. Like, we started from the moment where we started talking about it to the moment where the technology and everything started coming together to make it possible. Like, we started experimenting about 2 months post that conversation, and then it took literally all the way till the week before the performance, before things really kind of settled in finally. But it was very exciting. That way of creation meant that we could talk to speak to the moment, and we were all at that moment still trapped at home, and we were still wondering about the course of the pandemic and when life would begin to kind of ease back. There was the promise of vaccines, but it didn't exist yet. And every single day that we rehearsed, one of our cast members would have a totally pandemic related thing that we had to deal with. It would be like, I just remember Mimi, our lead soprano's mother, coming in one day saying, well, I'm a frontline worker. She was working in a hospital as a nurse, or, later on we'll be talking to another cast member, and, they would be having all kinds of issues, finding a room to perform in, because everybody's trying to live at home, and you're trying to perform opera from your bedroom in the middle of a multi-story building in New York, and it's just not so easy, So all of these things came together, but we should also mention Kervin Huber, right? And Jonathan Robertson, who wrote the software that made it possible for us to perform across the country live through the internet, with no kind of lag, and to kind of put our characters inside of this 3D environment, and do all of that work, so that it was possible to reach audiences in new ways. So the 3 operas that we did, Alice in the Pandemic talked about frontline workers, and that was the most immediate thing, and it was successful enough. It really galvanized us to do more stuff once we realized that we could. And the next one, and in fact, overlapping this, of course, was once we knew that the concept was working, Cerise was already working on the next big thing, because, of course, we had, the events surrounding George Floyd's death, and the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things that Whitesnake did was to convene a think tank, and it was an open call to the creative community of opera to talk about what was needed to be told at that time. So, but before I go too far, I'm very aware of the time, thanks to Michael. I think we should show you a little bit of what we done, so that you have a sense of things. So if you wouldn't mind, we're going to start the video so you can see Alice in the Pandemic, which we mentioned.
down, that life is over when a candle is lit, a baby is born, alive. How do I find my mother's candle? Find the unmarked hand. Her candle will be under last name. Alice, you're Stretch out our hands, reach for each other. Take a deep breath and stretch our fingers until they touch the screen. Gently, gently, then firmly, more firmly. I touch you, I hold you, I feel, I see you through the sea, through the keyboard, through fiber optics. You are cherished, you are here. I am here, a son on my heart, carried by a dirty secret.
So that was a quick fast forward through all three shows and a quick poster at the end to talk about our show this weekend.
That's so exciting. Thank you so much to Georgina and Phil and Cerise and Tian for all of that context and all of that in-depth kind of unpacking of, not just what you do and how you do it, but the why and what that even means. I think as Cerise pointed out earlier, when she was talking to me about like how I, asked the two or the four of you or the two projects, to be in dialogue this evening. Of course, yes, that was no mistake, and that it's opera and classical music. Specifically the two, or Western opera and Western classical music, the two sort of high elite, high art performing art forms. And I think it also sort of feeds into a lot of tropes, a lot of stereotypes, unfortunately, in Western society and Euro-American society about Asians, about Asian artists and just Asians generally, or Asian Americans. I've in a lot of conversations, for example, with Asian classical musicians who are constantly dealing with this stereotype and this trope that there are so many, i.e., coded for too many Asians in orchestras, for example, and not talking about what it takes to be there, what people have to go through, how 90% of them are actually string players, and 80% of those are actually violin and viola players, and how the soloists being specifically violinists and pianists for the most part, in a way that sort of again feeds into this trope of this Orientalism and this exotification of Asianness and of the Asian body, and then in dance, being the kind of primary body-based art form, I think folks like Georgina and Phil and other Asian and Asian American dancers are embodying those and having projected onto them, as Gina pointed out earlier, projected onto them all those tropes and those stereotypes and those assumptions and those codes, about who we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to appear, how we're supposed to behave and act, with what energy, with what texture, with what color, with what gender identity, and with what gender style and personality, all those things. And so there's a reason I call this series Codemakers, which is, it's not just about it. We're always having to code switch, but then there's also as my friend and colleague Rennie Harris, the great hip hop and stage concert dance choreographer, always says to audiences.
That is a cliffhanger, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is.
What did he say?
You froze for a moment.
Where did it? Oh, yeah,
So-
my screen went black. What was the last thing you heard me say?
Code. We were just about to drop it.
Yeah, you're just about to drop the quote. Yeah.
So Rennie Harris, the great hip hop artist, concert dance choreographer, greatest hip hop concert dance choreographer of the last 30 years. He always says to audiences, when do we get to stop having to code switch? When does our language, our vernacular, our culture get to be the one who simply speaks? And so I guess that's my opening question to all of you is, your efforts are sort of making this space for yourselves. I think Whitesnake as an artistic, producer and platform has been doing that in so many ways. And I think, Georgina does it very much for herself as an individual artist. And then Final Bow for Yellowface / Gold Standard Arts is doing that, for the field. So I feel like the four of you are operating at every single level. So I don't know, maybe help the audience maybe unpack that issue. What does it mean to speak and having to deal with being spoken for all the time?
Who wants to tag in first?
I think that's you, darling.
I mean, my experience in what Cerise said when she said, I have built my own table. I find, I that struck me at my heart. I wasn't expecting to hear it. I knew that of each of these individuals here, but I have literally said that in meetings with artistic directors, being like, I am fully aware that this institution did not plan to have a place for me. And that in my near 20-year career at New York City Ballet, I have very, through diligence and through excellence and through a lot of like above and beyond work, have built my own specific path. And that's why I feel like it has been it's been incredibly hard, but I've learned so much about myself, and it's why I am this very strong-minded woman sitting here. It's why I am very outspoken, because I had to advocate for myself because no one else was advocating for me in the room. I had to advocate for a lot of time, but without even my actual voice. I just had to let my dancing speak for it, because I was not necessarily in a safe space in which I could turn to someone and say, this is what I'm feeling. It would have immediately, I was asked to be the sex symbol. You be this trope. This is who you are. No, you don't get to be the queen, because we don't see you as the queen. We see you as the exotic other. So that's what you will do. And I just felt myself in my experience as a dancer, yes, I'm a very sensual person, and I have no qualms with that. And I have no qualms with sharing that side of me, but I also can embody this, and I'm very good at this. And it's expanding people's minds. And I think what's so great about what Final Bow has done is that it's empowered other people to do the work and to open this, perhaps, this interesting side door, or put on a different pair of glasses to see someone in a new way and give them a chance. And it's not done by like slapping people on the wrist and saying like, you're racist. It's just like, what if this can be true, but also this is true. And the fact that also, like, Phil and I are both multicultural. So yes, I am Filipino, but yes, I also full well know that I've gotten this far because I pass in for until I put my stage makeup on, I can walk in the studio and for the most part pass as a white dancer. And so that sort of code switching back and forth, but then know that I will never be seen in the roles that I know that I can embody, in the roles that I have earned a chance to be seen out on stage with. That's where it gets extremely difficult for me, and to be just brutally honest, quite painful. I mean, I talk a lot about it in my own book, Swan Dive, and then also just in our talks through Final Bow, just what this experience is to know that, yeah, I pass enough, but I'm not accepted by the institution to be the full expression of who I am as a ballerina.
And I think there's a flip to that too, where it's like, I think where Whitesnake is making their own table, there's a big part of our work that is still fighting to be at the main table. Like our approach with Gold Standard is not like, we could have started an Asian American dance company. Like there's Alvin Ailey or Dance Theater of Harlem that focuses on the Black expression in dance. Ballet Hispanico supports and nurtures, Latinx voices. There really isn't something like that for Asians in ballet, but we could start something like that. But I think our decision was, well, why should we reinvent the wheel? Why do we have to start a dance company, and compete with multi-million-dollar companies that already exist? They're posting the black square. They're saying, yes, equity, inclusion. They're saying, yes, these rooms belong to you too. And I think for us, it's been us saying, well, fine, you're saying that we belong in this room, then give us the room. Give us whatever rehearsal weeks you were going to give to the white choreographer, give them to an Asian choreographer too. Oh, that costume budget, that's a really nice chunk of change. You were going to give that to a white choreographer. Well, when the Asian choreographer comes in for our turn, give us that same budget. That's all we're asking for. We're not asking you to make more space. We're asking you to share the space you already have, because that's what you've been saying about equity, diversity, inclusion, right? That's what you mean. You're saying those spaces also belong to us. So then make room for us to sit at that table, because we belong. and we're just even shifting our own mindset of saying, knock knock, are we allowed in here? No, we just walk in the room with our heads held high, just like everybody else, because it's our room too. And that's it. We're not backing down. That's the attitude we're taking. These are our spaces too, which is equally important as carving out our own space to say, okay, well, this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to, it's two different approaches that are complementary and necessary.
My goodness,
Yeah, we all share the same issue, which is, even with carving out a production company that uplifts activism and BIPOC voices. The problem, of course, is gatekeeping, which a lot of people haven't really addressed. But for me, I'm turning my attention now to who are the gatekeepers and how they prevent Asian American BIPOC artists from really getting to center stage, and getting the recognition, because a lot of times they don't understand the voice, they don't understand the move, they don't understand the story, because they are like Puccini. They have a fantasy of who we are or what we do or what we ought to be, and when reality hits them, they don't recognize it, and therefore they say it isn't good, it doesn't meet the standard. It's simply not understanding. So I think one way, at least in my way of thinking, is to have more and more of these kinds of different and new works out there, because I can actually feel momentum, that the opinions, that so few people control this gate. And if I can just get it to open, so many people can walk through, right? So that really is part and parcel of our mission.
I think too, it's important as we are also stepping up and we are also making our own spaces, that we actually become gatekeepers ourselves, right? Cerise is in charge of deciding who she's going to commission for Whitesnake, in the same way that we are also helping companies choose which Asian choreographers get commissioned. So in some sense, we are bypassing a traditional gatekeeping, but we're also building our own gates in some way. Like for us, we are focused on Asian issues. Neither one of us are South Asian. So as we are building this work, we have to constantly push a little harder to say, are we including South Asian voices? The AAPI and AAPI, Pacific Islanders, there's some discussion about whether that needs to be its own group, because you lump in the PI with the AA and all you see is Chinese, Japanese, East Asian, and you don't see all the other Asianness. I mean, I think politically we are so small as Asians. We make up less than 10% of the US population. And so this term Asian American was created to give us collective political bargaining power, but it's a term that is so big that it doesn't always serve us. And so even as we are dismantling traditional gates and bypassing traditional gatekeepers, we almost have to be hyper aware that we aren't just being complicit and perpetuating that same system that is exclusionary. We have to do better as our own gatekeepers.
Tian, you were going to say something.
I was going to say so much, but I have so many bookmarks in my brain. I'm not sure where to begin. But I want to kind of begin maybe chronologically and backwards and say, the term like Asia is just such a problematic term in the first place, right? Because it's like this European term of anything that wasn't Europe, then that was kind of and for the longest time they thought that North America was going to be Asia when they were looking for it, right? They were looking for India. So I think that the root of that is problematic to begin with. But I was just thinking also about code switching and how we had to do it in a way. I think about how some of my earliest experiences within the field, so to speak. I went to the UK to try to get professional training. And I remember, and this is no discredit to my classmates, I just don't think it was in the culture at the time, but I literally had to use my elbows, like, physically, and so that I could join the circle of conversation in almost every setting. I mean, like, I know you guys are all talking about a project, but I want in on that. And since your circle is not opening, I'm literally going to part you physically and insert myself, then start talking. And I'm not kidding. I mean this, that this was something that had to happen. And I think about that as a source of strength, because, and I also think about how this big term of Asia also reflects the fact that all of these peoples were being discriminated against, right? And so it was kind of a very natural thing for me to think about, well, if we all have this thing about code switching, what we basically had to do is to learn how to talk to different people differently, right? And to understand where they're coming from, and to get that perspective, and what a valuable lesson that is. And in fact, that became for me almost like a philosophical approach to anything I'm going to perform. Do I understand the context, and how do I get in contact with that? And I don't make any assumptions, right? And the assumptions, and it's always very interesting to investigate those assumptions. So I think, that code switching thing has become almost like a model for my own engagement with art and it's one of the reasons why I work with musics of so many different cultures. But I also want to kind of talk a little bit about about why it was that it was perhaps why were there so many East Asians in classical music. And there's a fantastic book on Asian American musicians in classical music right now. One of the things it points out was that phenomenon really only started with screened auditions, meaning that practice in orchestras where you audition folks and they play behind a screen, and for the first time you were so-called being more objective, and you can kind of just listen to the pure sound. And that was the first time these people got in, and this was the first time that women also got in to the major orchestras of the country. And so when we speak as if it is like ancient history, like a lot of the professional orchestras became fully professional in the 70s and the 80s. A lot of these people were first joining the orchestras in the 80s and the 90s. And so it's not by any, it's a myth, there are so very many of them, and as Cerise was speaking, is often within very, very kind of limited areas of classical music. But I wonder also primarily about cultural aspects. I just think about how I wasn't trying to be Western so much as I was thinking about my own cultural upbringing of not being verbally expressive. It was frowned upon. It was, don't speak unless you have something truly extraordinary to say. If nothing, if your point is not going to change the tenor of the conversation, then it's not pretty much worth it. So it was this kind of like non-verbal the way of communicating. It was a communication of gesture. And I remember specific conversations with my grandmother about how she would express anger at the dinner table. She would put her pair of chopsticks down a little harder and it would make a sound as opposed to being perfectly silent. That was the way she expressed anger. And it was the smallest click and you knew, like it was so kind of bound up into this world of sound and physicality that I found myself really, really, finding the one place where I could study this in abstraction to be absolutely fascinating. And this was classical music, and it was kind of, I wonder, and this is just literally a fresh thought in the last 5 minutes, I wonder how many of my colleagues shared that it was a language of gesture, a language of sound, because speaking was too direct. And for the longest time, we didn't really necessarily have the language to talk about these issues either. So it was this, we have this saying in Chinese that you are kind of, it's a steeped kind of unhappiness. It's steeped like steam trapped in a box. And, and so I think, then finally we're allowed to be expressive because of this wonderful thing called 19th century romanticism, so like, it's kind of interesting. And I don't mean that to be a closed conversation, but just to offer it up as a thought about my own practice.
Well, I think even for us, I think we choose these art forms that are considered high art, that are sort of worth more in society's eyes, because if we don't, we won't be able to achieve the success otherwise. Like, yeah, okay, so you could do your ethnic art form and you'll be seen as an ethnic person, or you could dance for New York City Ballet, Okay, so you could paint subjects that are traditional and sort of ethnic and cultural, or you could have your paintings up in the MoMA. And I think the after Atlanta, I had a collaborator come up to me and say, there's a tragedy with the gatekeepers, that some of them are deeply racist and they don't even know it. And the sad tragedy is we have to work with them if we want careers. We need to work with the MoMAs and the New York City ballets and the Metropolitan Operas of the world in order to be seen as legitimate, expressive, world-class, respected, serious artists. Otherwise you're just a folk dancer dancing around in a fan, or you're doing, square dancing, whatever it is, but like, we need to be in those rooms. We need to be in those spaces in order to be taken seriously. And that sucks.
So for me, that brings up, another challenge, namely tokenism. And so going back to the numbers issue of Asians in classical music a second ago, for example, I haven't read the data, but my anecdotal experience over and over and over is it really comes, I keep hearing people saying, oh, there's plenty of Asians in classical music. Why, just in so-and-so orchestra, there's a da 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 in the violin section, or there's a da 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 who's been the concertmaster for, and they usually name a single individual human being, and that's defined as there's Asians everywhere. In other words, for me, it almost is the legacy of Yellow Peril, and of foreignness, and of this sort of sort of this latent, it's not just racism, it's also this sort of deep, sort of trope of foreignness that's weaponized against us when it's useful, and it's fed to us as like a little, throwing us a bone when it's useful for the dominant culture.
But it also pits us against each other, because we know that like one will be allowed in and then the door will swiftly slam shut. And so I think what's amazing about this conversation and these people here is that we are all of the mindset that we are busting the door open and we're dragging anyone who will come along with us into the light. And I think that's where the focus of especially like Gold Standard Arts is. And when I'm in my lowest and Phil has to like pick me up off the rehearsal floor, and he's like, just remember you being there, you being in the space, you showing up every day regardless of what's happening, you dancing, just showing up. It's a form of activism. And then you continue to go above and beyond. So just showing up, being in those spaces, but like I'm taking that a step further and being like, no, come along with me. Empower yourselves, dancers, to find your own voice, because the voice is powerful, and it's how I think being able to code switch in these spaces has made it. We've had to do the extra work to be fluent in problem solving, and I think that's what will make us really wonderful and exciting leaders, because we have never had the opportunity to just sit back and be complacent. We've always had to think, okay, this is the path that other people have traveled that is not necessarily open to me. What other paths are there? And we usually come up with one and then two extra just in case, right?
I think there's something too about this tokenism thing, about we sort of have to look at the model minority myth as part of this thing. Gina and I did a series of interviews last May during COVID called What's the Tea, where we interviewed a different Asian dancer every single day during the month of May. So 31 days of Asian Pacific Heritage Month, 31 different interviews with different Asian dancers. And we thought it'd be a piece of cake because we're all trapped inside during COVID. And we're like, oh, we'll just talk to our friends one a day. It was a ton of work. It was producing a daily TV show with no experience. I mean, it was like, but we did it. But what we found was that in all of these interviews, the dancers we were talking to fit into two categories. They were either from Asia and they were trained as members of the majority. So I went to Shanghai Ballet School. My race was not an issue. All my teachers were Chinese. I went home and I spoke Chinese. Nobody was looking at me saying, oh, we can only have two of them, because everybody in my class was also Shanghainese. So no barriers to me succeeding accept my own natural talent or lack thereof. And then an American company sees this talented Shanghainese person, hires them as a dancer, and then they say, look, we don't have a problem with Asians because look, there's an Asian person right here. Whereas if we actually, and the other category was people like me and Gina that were able to pass. We were able to sort of go through the American system, but just by skirting through. And so what that tells us is that we're still failing our dancers of Asian descent who are born here in America, but because we are importing them from Asia, it's really easy to say, oh no, we don't have an Asian problem because look right there. But it's like, no, she's from Shanghai, she's from Japan, you know, she's not Asian American, and we can't just prop her up as a success story because it blinds us to the actual issues that face us. So
so something else that came up in some of the conversations we had ahead of today was this idea of the work that folks like yourselves are doing is really questioning. I mean, we've talked about it a lot here, the questioning the European center. In other words, questioning, among other things, the fact that the aesthetic and the set of aesthetic and cultural values are centering what the dominant culture that's always been centered. So, you know, what is it? What are some ideas or strategies or models that any of you have thought of to, you know, not just simply push back at that and to decenter, which is, of course, really, really lifelong hard work that a lot of great artists and activists in every field are doing, but to actually center those things in a different way. So like, is it a matter of changing the nature of a production and, you know, not just simply throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Like if you do Madama Butterfly, you know, do you never do it again? Or do you do it differently and, dare I say, better? Is better even possible? Do you create a production that talks about what it means to try and do it better? Like, you know, I don't have the answers to these questions, but I know that, you know, the nature of the work that some of you do, it's sort of wrapped up in that. So if anybody, I'm just curious if anybody has any thoughts.
Well, we're literally in a dance studio right now. We just finished rehearsing. We have a ballet that's premiering in 2 weeks at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's called the Ballet de Porcelain, or the Teapot Prince, and it's a ballet from 1739. And it's this Baroque ballet that we have reimagined with an all-Asian creative team. And the ballet, it's basically when Europeans discovered the secret of making porcelain, they made this ballet about a Chinese sorcerer who lives on a blue island of porcelain who traps people in porcelain. And then this like white prince and princess who come and steal his magic wand and then like turn him into porcelain. They're like, yay, we triumphed over Asia. Like that was the ballet. And so how do we flip that script? How do we change it? What happens when we put people of color in these roles that traditionally were not supposed to be, or flip the script? What universal truths emerge, but what new truths come out? So that's a process we're working on now. I'm working on a production of Madama Butterfly with Boston Lyric Opera that also similarly questions the Eurocentric nature of this work, and also staging a full-length ballet called La Bayadere, which takes place in sort of a hoochie-coochie fantasy India. But we're going back to the steps, you know, the notation, and it's actually quite a conservative approach, but we're setting it in the sort of 1920s American cowboy fantasy, as opposed to it being sort of an Indian fantasy. So we're keeping tradition alive, but questioning that Eurocentric nature of this work and making it so that the multicultural companies that perform these works don't have to blacken up, and the audiences that are also multiracial don't need a program note or don't need copious education to say now that this is going to be offensive, but enjoy the show. So, you know, I think that when we think about diversity and you know, diversity training and shifting the center, it feels like a burden, or it feels like a lot of work, like, oh, now we have to talk about diversity. But it's actually, if you shift your attitude, this could be, and I believe is going to be, the next creative push for our time, for our generation. I mean, look at Hamilton. Hamilton questions the Eurocentric white center of our story as a nation, our founding story. What happens when men of color are telling that story? What new dynamics come up that show us more about ourselves when only told through this way? And so I do think that shifting that center away from Europe is the greatest driver and wellspring of creativity for the next generation. And we're on the front lines of that conversation. And if we figure out how to make that shift, our art is going to be so much more interesting and for everybody. Sell tickets, money, Chinese people. We love money.
I really, I really agree with what you say, but I have a slightly different take on things. I mean, from the opera perspective, is that at the time when Puccini wrote, say, Butterfly or Turandot or anything, he had never ever been to Japan or China. Okay, so this was like totally fantasy, you know, because there's this craze for chinoiserie and all things Eastern, and they, you know, have all these sort of like ideas about it, and it was never meant to really be really about Japanese or Asians. And part of the problem, okay, the way I look at it as far as opera is that because Asian American, that we Asians want to be part of opera. And so what happens is and we're never going to be cast to sing, you know, Anna Bolena or Mimi or whatever, because we don't look like a white tuberculosis ridden heroine, right? But we do look like Chow Chow San, or we do look like Turandot. So an opera written by people who have never been to Asia, who only fantasize about it, never meant to be performed by Asians. Now all of a sudden, everybody's casting Asians in it, and then we're saying, "Oh my God!" But it's so insulting to Asians. Of course it is, because it never based on reality. So I mean, a very interesting perspective on this is when I went to see The Mikado. Not recently, but A New Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan Society in New York. And they had to postpone it by 1 year because there was such an outrage. Again, Gilbert and Sullivan had no idea of anything. And it was meant to be a satire of hierarchy and English society and all of that. But it became offensive when we cast Asian in it because we were forced to play ping, pong, and pong. Who even heard of these crazy names, right? And so what they did was they had a little prologue in which Gilbert and Sullivan are discussing, you know, oh, let's make this fantasy opera. We've never been to China. We have no freaking idea what these Chinese people are like. But we're going to fantasize and we're going to make it up. And it's going to be a satire and a parody and really ridiculous because we want to satirize English society by doing it through, you know, this Asian look. And yeah. And so it sort of like took the sting out of it too, because and then they didn't have Asian costumes. So a lot of things were, they dressed them all in Victoriana. Okay. So it was a very interesting take on it by really bringing it back to the origins, you know.
Well, Cerise, I do have some good news for you. I know that we have the Asian Opera Alliance tuning into this talk tonight, so shout out to our friends at the Asian Opera Alliance. But what they are,
hello, Asian Opera
Alliance. So what the Asian Opera Alliance is doing is they're sort of a sister organization to Final Bow. They're really taking up the same space in the conversation. But in opera. And so, yes, the question of who gets to sing Mimi, who gets to sing Anna Bolena, like, yes, we are saying, don't just pigeonhole us into Cho-Cho-san. Yeah, I'm happy to sing Butterfly, but I also want to sing Queen of the Night. I also want to sing the roles that you thought of were just Europeans, but Tosca is just as much a fantasy as Cho-Cho-san. I mean, who is Tosca? Where's the reality of Tosca? You know, so why couldn't that be a Japanese person singing Tosca?
Truly.
So that is changing. I'm just letting you know, Cerise, we are working on that.
Good, good.
I know we are kind of at time. Can I
So-
just chime in very quickly? Like, when you were talking about 18th century ballet, I found myself thinking about this because, when we look at 18th century music, one of the big realizations in the 50s and the 60s is that we were playing it in a way that was completely a fantasy of what it was supposedly in the 18th century, which is to say it sounded nothing like it. And one of the things that has happened is this, historical performance study thing, and that kind of has resulted in what is like 5 or 6 decades of never-ending conversations about how should this be played? How did they play it back then? And how do they play it because of their circumstances? I find that an interesting thing, at least, within the larger kind of realm of classical music, that allowed us to have that conversation about looking at music written by people with multiple or different cultural heritages, and then actually engaging that topic. But also, the various kind of interventions. I mean, Cerise and I have talked about, like, sometimes you just can't change the story. Or how about writing a complete new version of it, text-wise, and the music stays? And just so many different, and I've kind of experimented with commissioning new work that was in dialogue with the work, kind of like, what we were talking about, inserting a new text, and adding these various opportunities. And so, that's like a response to various points that people raised. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about that idea of, like, throwing the door open. And one of the things that I found so moving in my conversations with Cerise early on was that we believe not just in throwing the door open, but to look backwards and say, this guy could have come through the door if I had thrown it open 5 minutes earlier. And going back to make sure that the effects of that door being shut are, at least, we try and do what we can to erase or at least help the person through the door, so that the next door becomes possible, and so on. I just want to leave everybody with that thought.
Yeah, that's something I really admire about Whitesnake's work. Every production it doesn't just look and feel intersectional. It actually operates sort of DNA level and in an intersectional way. And having, and knowing your work better and knowing the two of you better, that's something, yeah, I just even more deeply admire about what you do. So just a shout out to the audience. We're in our last few minutes here before we have to wrap things up. So if anybody has any question, they're able to post in the chat on the YouTube feed. Please do so now. Otherwise, for those of you who are tuning in or who weren't able to, this conversation will be posted afterwards on our Fine Arts Center YouTube channel. So you can watch it there and let your other colleagues and friends know about it. But sort of to start to wrap this up, I'm curious for you folks, what are some long-term? You've talked about some goals. I'm wondering if there's any other long-term goals for practical change, maybe that you haven't mentioned, that are really sort of at the core, or maybe like your latest dream for what you'd like to accomplish someday.
What? I mean, I have no control over my particular day-to-day life as a ballerina, but I am certainly trying to ascend. I think it would mean a lot to, and I don't expect this, but to be able to break the glass ceiling and become the first Asian American woman that's a principal dancer at New York City Ballet, I think that would be really, truly powerful for generations coming up. Not just for me. I mean, at this point, like, we're not, it's
you're not doing Swan Lake.
That's not something that I need in the sense of that kind of ego. I'm not gunning to do Swan Lake. I'm more of a Firebird. But I think that I mean, wasn't there just Sesame Street just debuted their first Asian American female puppet, and wow, as someone who grew up watching Sesame Street, that would have meant so much to have. And I think it's time for companies, for people, for us to really sort of acknowledge that, speaking of the doors being opened and like acknowledge the time of what we put in here, who the people we've been around for a while now, is to acknowledge this effort that everyone on this panel has put forth to try to not only make it for themselves, but to inspire the generations younger.
So my hope for Whitesnake is, we are like Final Bow for Yellowface, 5 years old. So we just celebrated our 5th birthday, and now I'm looking to the next 5 years. And I really, really would like to be an incubator for BIPOC creators. And because right now we are doing it, but we find that a lot of composers are still afraid to really create their own authentic voice or sound. And so what I would love to do is create a whole new environment where people can experiment with different voices, not just sort of like have BIPOC creators create in the Western tradition. And, to expand the repertoire, so it's not BIPOC creating traditional Western stuff, but BIPOC's creating truly unique sounding, looking, speaking work. And that will come in stages because we have so many obstacles to overcome. First is acceptance within ourselves, our own community. And then, of course, there's the whole gatekeeper external community issue. And the whole building of enough trust and understanding of the differences in our cultures to be able to provide proper direction and mentorship. And that's what Tian and I, we talk about this all the time, non-notational music, different sounds, different kinds of stories. And that's what we hope for. I don't want to speak for Tian. Tian should say his own thing.
Well, I want to say that our slightly different take on it, which is that we've been looking at the ecosystem at large, right? And trying to figure out where are the areas of need and things that have been neglected for a long time, and where are those glass ceilings that we can help with. In other words, also recognizing that some of we also enjoy a certain amount of privilege, those of us who are on this panel, because we've had opportunities that many haven't, and how can we actually kind of transmit that to others, and that's just been a large part of our work, and trying to create a way to make that work sustainable is our immediate kind of goal, to make sure that this can continue to grow organically as it wants to.
I think we have a question in the chat that's asking us what's the value for us in working for white-led arts organizations and also to a largely white audience. I think, unfortunately, Gina and I have both bitten the ballet bug since a very early age. I think it's been a way for us to find our own personal strength, our own voice when we didn't have it, and a sense of power that I don't think we have had elsewhere, and that we found through dancing. There's a freedom that comes with it that is unlike anything else, and it's a deep love of the art form, and that's why we care so much. Our pledge starts with "I love ballet." It affirms our love. It comes from a place of our love, and that's why, because we are beautiful in it, and because it's beautiful for us, and it's given us so much. So if we can share that with other people and give someone else that same feeling of strength and empower somebody else, what a better way than to share something you love.
And I think that also speaks to Sheena's question that she asked, what keeps you going through all the red tape and bureaucracy that slows change in ballet and classical music worlds? I mean, it's the passion, it's the love of what we do. And I think it's also the recognition by all these wonderful folks here on the screen that music and dance is a universal language. It is a unifier, what we do at base. So why don't we continue to do that and find a way to make this universal language just expand even more?
I have a slightly different perspective on that, because in the sense that it doesn't always have to be only white, this audience. And that's something that, or majority white. I see it as a dial that can move. And I've certainly been to concerts where I've finally had people come to me say, I've never ever seen myself represented on stage before. And now I have. And I'm going to come back, and that is something that keeps me going, so that answers both Sheena as well as Hye Young's questions. And the fact that I think that, this vision of a beautiful world where there's infinite varieties of expression within music and dance that can share the stage together and can exist independently, can evolve in any direction that we want it to go. In fact, the main thing I want to make sure is that we don't all shortchange ourselves by not letting these voices in the room. And it's so exciting when all of these voices come together that we haven't heard, or we haven't heard them tell certain stories. I think it keeps me going.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for all of your beautiful work, all of your beautiful expression and ideas, and just, blood, sweat, and tears and triumph. And I just, I just so appreciate everything that you're doing. And I just love that, we're so much on the doing so many different things, and yet so much, as you were all saying, so much on the same page, and just coming at all of these gigantic issues from every angle and coming out of it to, at every angle as well, to every possible audience. And so just, bravi to all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you again to our sponsors for tonight's event, the Mass Cultural Council, the Daily Hampshire Gazette, New England Public Media, UMass Auxiliary Services, and Hotel UMass. And thank you again to our audience now and in future for the archived version of tonight's event. Again, on our YouTube channel at UMass Fine Arts Center. If we can't do work like this without the generosity of not only our sponsors, but our donors, people like yourselves. So if you have it in your heart, if you have it in your wallet, if you can consider donating as well, you can go to fineartscenter.com/giving. Otherwise, thank you again to all of our artists, to all of our backstage crew, and everyone who attended tonight's event. And please stay safe, stay beautiful, and we'll see you next time.